The fig tree analogy. One of the most famous modern metaphors from Sylvia Plath's 1963 novel The Bell Jar, this quotation is cited as a poetic exploration of the universal dilemma that is the endless possibilities that life has to offer. Furthermore, encapsulating the social predicament of women in the 1950s between various sectors of being, a quandary between possibility and tradition, in the eventualization of these futures withering away from subsequent indecision. In the modern age of social media, however, this quote has taken on a new life and meaning. In fact, the whole identity of the bell jar has become an integral part of a specific female intellectual community, mostly comprised of young girls, who identify with Plath's astutely romantic yet grisly depiction of a promising young woman experiencing a mental breakdown at the precipice of her potential. The bell jar has garnered a specific aesthetic personality in these communities, emphasized by the hundreds of photographs centering the novel in a composition that hypothesizes it as some sort of feminine Bible, as well as the many references to this novel in traditional media that have found themselves continuously reposted as a symbol of intellect. For those unfamiliar, The Bell Jar is a novel by the author Sylvia Plath that details the life of Esther Greenwood, a young, ambitious woman who during a prestigious summer internship is exposed to and burdened by the immense oppression that she faces as a woman. The severity of her subsequent anxiety and depression intensifies, and she is admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where she continues to witness and experience tragedy until eventually she's allowed to return to college at the end of the novel despite her own uncertainty. There are many elements of this novel that have been and should continue to be praised. It remains a powerful and relatable depiction of patriarchal pressures and mental health struggles, consequently becoming a great symbol of women's issues in society. The character of Esther Greenwood is a dynamic character whose clashing intelligence and depression resonates with many young women. And this kind of acute representation, especially concerning the social context of when the book was published, is truly a gift. Not to mention the masterful writing of Sylvia Plath, which creates a sharply poetic feel that contrasts yet greatly complements the novel subject matter completely and utterly. All of this makes the novel just as enticing and empowering as it was when it was first published. But despite its immense power and relatability, this novel is often romanticized in a way that is unprecedented, surmounting in its glorified social media presence modernly despite some of its truly problematic context. The main problem with The Bell Jar is its promotion of racist stereotypes and ideologies, and the neglect that this aspect of the novel faces. It is no secret that Esther is an extremely judgmental character, and thus that her perspective as an unreliable narrator is going to highlight those aspects of her personality. But it is also no secret that this novel is semi-autobiographical. Esther is consistently quick to judge other women based on their superficial appearances, personalities, and more, without really empathizing with their own personal struggles. Some, though, may argue that this pharisaiticness is simply working to exemplify her internal struggles with societal expectations being projected onto others, but Esther's glorified cynicism crosses the line into racism many times throughout the novel. There are a handful of comments that Esther makes using harmful slurs and stereotypical derogatory descriptions of various ethnic features, which, though somewhat subtle, normalize this type of dialogue and discrimination. And even further, Plath invents a few characters who are very much racially motivated and whose behavior stem from racist ideologies. For example, in one of the book's most vividly uncomfortable yet important moments, when Esther is sexually assaulted, the scene is tinged by the stereotypical depiction of Marco as a sexually motivated Latino, which promotes harmful ideas about marginalized groups being inherently violent through fetishization. Later on, when Esther is admitted to a psychiatric ward, There's a black nurse who is depicted as completely indolent and stupid for serving 2 kinds of beans for dinner. His speech is written in a way that is extremely stereotypical, and in the end, Esther physically assaults the man, kicking him for his mistake. These blatantly racist scenes are of course the majority of the book's problems, but it is the fact that the bell jar has become so intrinsic to the identity of young women through its idolization on the internet without a proper discussion of its harmful perpetuation of racist ideologies that makes this such a massive problem. And even so, the bell jar is actually just one example of how the algorithmic promotion and glorification of second and first wave feminist literature to young women and girls without proper contextualization and criticism indicates a rise in white-centric feminism, the erasure of intersectional voices, and attitudes that forewarn the growth of oppression and division in an increasingly conservative America. Throughout Western history, there have been many waves of feminism. First wave feminism started in the late 19th century and continued into the 20th century. And second wave feminism dates between the 1960s and the 1980s. And then third and fourth wave feminism have continued this movement into the 21st century. Each of these feminist movements strove for further equality in various different ways, and each did its part in bringing forth real societal change in the Western world. But often, in an attempt to facilitate this change, racist ideologies were promoted. For example, during first wave feminism in America, Black Americans and American women were both advocating for suffrage simultaneously. According to an article by the National Women's History Museum, the leading first wave feminists like Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did not even support the passing of the 15th Amendment that prohibited discrimination based on race because they believed that if anyone deserved to vote, it was the educated white woman first. And in further waves, such as second wave feminism, again the concerns of Black women and other marginalized women were ignored and pushed to the sidelines, while the concerns of white, middle-class, educated women were prioritized, with issues like forced sterilization and the overall experience of racial and gender discrimination simultaneously were completely disregarded. This became a defining point between 2 emerging ideologies concerning feminism: white feminism and intersectionality. White feminism is defined as a form of feminism that centers around the experience of white women, and the form of feminism that has been the most popularized over the last few centuries. White feminists may tend to look at aspects of a person and potential discrimination as separate from one another, and thus prioritize their own experience of oppression as a woman and find only those narratives of similar women as valuable to the progression of women's rights. Some white feminists who perpetuated racist ideologies, eugenics, and exclusionary feminism through these ideologies were Virginia Woolf, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Mary Wollstonecraft, Margaret Atwood, and Betty Friedan, whose novels are romanticized in a similar way to the bell jar on social media today, with an indistinguishable disregard for their problematic white feminist lenses. During second wave feminism, however, the ideology of intersectionality emerged to counter the privileged notion of white feminism. Intersectionality is defined as a way of looking at the various aspects of a person's social identity and how they combine to create a unique experience of discrimination and privilege. As opposed to looking at the aspects of a person separately, intersectional thinkers may look at a person as a Venn diagram, where the center represents their own personal unique experience of oppression and privilege. Authors who championed intersectionality include Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, Gloria E. Nzaldua, and Audre Lorde, whose works focus on intersectionality in a personal, social, and political sense. One of the most important works of literature to the contemporary understanding of intersectionality is Audre Lorde's 1984 novel Sister Outsider. Although Lorde is traditionally considered a poet, this novel acts as a combination of her personal prose, essays, speeches, and interviews over a decade, centering around her identity as a Black woman, lesbian, poet, activist, cancer survivor, mother, and feminist. Throughout the novel, Lorde reveals many of the core principles of intersectionality and overall encourages a shift in the way that society, but specifically white women, must demolish a patriarchal view and approach to equality. She, perhaps most famously, points out that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, exemplifying this point. There is an additional, foremost relevant point that Lorde makes as she examines why white women are hesitant to embrace intersectionality, writing that, "I believe one of the reasons white women have such a difficulty reading Black women's work is because of their reluctance to see Black women as women different from themselves. To examine Black women's literature effectively requires that we be seen as whole people in our actual complexities, as individuals, as women, as human, rather than as one of those problematic but familiar stereotypes provided in this society in place of genuine images of Black women. And I believe that this holds true for the literatures of other women of color who are not Black." This speculation upon the separation and divide between white women and women of color in terms of literary and personal identification is presented with the solution of reading and consuming consciously in order to eliminate these barriers. As Lorde writes, "And where the words of women are crying to be heard, we must each of us recognize our responsibility to seek those words out, to read them and share them and examine their pertinence in our lives." Whilst the bell jar emphasizes a singular white woman's experience, inviting elements of racist ideology and the promotion of white feminism, Sister Outsider uses a lens of intersectionality to explore the core inequality in society and to encourage to demolish the discrimination and divide within feminism. While Lorde writes a stern yet empathetically powerful letter to Mary Daly about her exclusion of women of color in her novel Gynecology, the Meta-Ethics of Radical Feminism, encouraging an open dialogue and warning of its dangers of such neglect playing into racist ideology, Plath's writing has played into a modern trend of the performative male, who is often seen carrying around the bell jar not from a belief in its principles, but simply to attract women. These examples demonstrate the true divide between white feminism and intersectionality. The behaviors that each novel encourages is no coincidence, and there's something to be said of that. It is the difference between a blueprint for action and an invitation for exclusion. But despite intersectionality being a historical ideology and a form of thinking about human rights, books like The Bell Jar are glorified and promoted in places of novels like Sister Outsider. And at that, white feminist literature is not being held accountable for its promotion of racist ideologies and discrimination. Moreover, it is the fact that intersectional voices are being erased in the literary world and beyond, quietly seizing the power of literature as a form of expression and encouraging the practice of social fundamentalism in a time where the extinction of any narrative to make room for the typically white and typically male is catastrophic. In this, accompanied by the rise in conservatism, rewinds the historical practices as aforementioned, and furthermore warns the practice of authoritarian and fascist regimes banning, censoring, or controlling books and literary material to serve an oppressive agenda. Look at it this way. When intersectional voices and perspectives are censored, first and second wave feminist ideals are clung onto in the literary world. The popularization of such narratives, especially amongst the young generation of women and girls, glorifies early feminist policy, which, though revolutionary, also contains mass aspects of racism, anti-abortion policy, further traditional gender roles, and more, which normalize and amplify conservative policies and accompanying social norms and tendencies. Roe v. Wade is overturned. The wage gap widens. Access to healthcare becomes a luxury. Sexual harassment and violence grows. This is horrendous for everyone. Yes, the young white women and girls in this country, but more devastatingly so, the woman whose intersectional identity affords them unprecedented discrimination and disenfranchisement in a modern era that is frankly unthinkable. It's unthinkable, but it's historically, theoretically, and factually real. So don't let the fig rot. Consume media consciously. Consider intersectional perspectives. As Cheryl Clark wrote in the preface to Sister Outsider, it is about women redefining difference. Redefine the difference in a time where change is needed.